Well, if you look at the weather outside, you would think I was going to speak on Noah, but I'm not this morning. It's Abraham. Um, and I noticed the weather isn't dampening the spirits of any South Africans in the room either. So if you weren't aware, South Africa won the Rugby World Cup yesterday. Um, and I want to start by talking about some triathletes. But before we get there, we are continuing in our series on a journey of faith. And this morning I am talking about faith to sacrifice all. Faith to sacrifice all. Back in 2012 and 2016, there were two brothers, the Brownlee brothers, who should come up on the screen. And they were world-class triathletes. They medaled well in the 2012 Olympics, and the older brother, Alistair, in the 2016 won gold. He's the one on your, I think he's the one on your right, and Jonathan Brownlee on the left of the screen is a younger brother. He got silver in the 2016 Olympics. And then they got to the World Championship Series in later in 2016, and then we've got a video of what happened there.
Second and third, but then less than 400 meters from the finishing line, unbelievable. Johnny Brownlee would start to find fatigue. He did not know where he was, and something that we have never seen before, Alistair Brownlee would help his brother to the finishing line. Henry Schoeman could not believe his eyes. He would have himself an ability to get to the finish and win the grand final. The crowd absolutely could not believe what they were seeing. Henry Schoeman, the man who had been the bronze medalist at the Olympic Games, would claim the grand final. What an incredible rock star season for Henry Schoeman. And as he crossed the line, he would look back and not believe what he was seeing. The two Brownlee brothers trying to make their way to their finishing line with Richard Murray just seconds behind. And Alistair Brownlee would help the younger of the Brownlees in, push him across the line. It would be Johnny second, Alistair third.
Yeah, well, I've been in that position before. And
we can stop it there, please.
In London.
I like the bit where he just unceremoniously throws him across the line. But Alistair, the older brother there, sacrificed winning a silver medal. He ended up with bronze, and even sacrificed getting a gold medal for the sake of his brother there. He sacrificed everything, as it were. And I wonder, what would you have done in that situation if you were fit enough to run a triathlon? I'm sure some of you might be. But if you saw somebody you knew well or a relative who was struggling, would you stop to help them? And I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, there may be some very competitive people here, but I'm sure most of us, all of us, would have stopped to help somebody. And there's times when we're willing to sacrifice for other people. But there's times when it's harder to sacrifice certain things. Mother Teresa said that a sacrifice to be real must cost. It must hurt and must empty ourselves. And this morning we're going to see how Abraham, when asked by God, was willing to sacrifice everything. And it was something that no doubt hurt him, no doubt something that was really costly for him. And as we go into this, I want you just to have the question in your mind. If God asked you to give something up, to sacrifice something, to release something, where would the line be? What would be hard in that? Where would be a challenge? When would it become a sacrifice? Because God does ask churches and God does ask Christians to sacrifice things for him. In the act of becoming a Christian is even a sacrifice and surrendering to him. But as we'll see with Abraham, through it all, he remembers who God is. Abraham is willing to go through this testing and this sacrifice because he remembers who God is. And we're going to see that he had a dreadful choice, that he took a daring risk, and that he had a deepening experience. So, a dreadful choice. Where Abraham is up to is that in the end of the previous chapter, chapter 21, he's made peace with a neighboring ruler or king, and he declares that God is the God who is everlasting. He is the God of all time, the God who is always with him. And he's in a really good place. And then God comes with this really awful request to sacrifice his own son. And to us, that is probably a very, very striking request, because in our culture we are so sensitive to the needs of the victim, and so we should be with all the abuse of power that we have seen. But actually this story is supposed to hit us between the eye. To the first Jewish readers who read this, it would have been awful to them as well, because God doesn't ask his people to sacrifice family, people, and children. Yet God comes to him and asks him to sacrifice his son, his only son. What this is about the relationship between God and Abraham. It's about the relationship between those two, and how out of this, Abraham's faith and relationship with God is deeper. Now, if you did GCSEs and then went on to A-level, I wonder if anybody said to you, one of your teachers said to you, well, what they told you in GCSE wasn't quite true. In fact, it was almost a lie. I experienced this when I did A-level chemistry. You get in GCSE chemistry, when they teach you about the makeup of an atom, in the middle they tell you there's the proton and the neutron, and round it in lovely pretty concentric circles are the electrons going round. You get to A-level chemistry and they tell you, no, that was a lie. In the middle there are protons and neutrons, but the electrons don't move in lovely patterns. They move in different planes, and sometimes in different shapes in figure of eights. And I'm sure if I'd taken that subject any further, they would have said, actually, we were lying to you there, because it's even more complicated than that is. And I was thinking about this. We don't actually always tell children in our Sunday groups quite the whole truth. We tell them, for instance, about how amazing Jesus' baptism was, that he was filled with the Spirit in that moment and heard the confirming voice of God saying he was his beloved son. And then in the next chapter, we tell children about how Jesus manages to resist temptation and resist the devil. But what we don't tell them is the connecting bit of that story. It's the Holy Spirit that led Jesus to the wilderness. It was the Holy Spirit who led Jesus straight to the devil. And I don't think I'd even realized this. In the Old Testament and New Testament, the word for testing and temptations are interchangeable. They're actually, when there's a testing to build us up, there's always an element of temptation that we will be pulled away from God. And whenever there's a temptation, there's actually opportunity for faith and testing to be built up. So Abraham here, when God is testing him to build him up, there's also that element of temptation where he could have been torn down and not done what God did and have been the worse for wear because of it. And Jesus, being led by the Spirit, being tempted, actually had opportunity for testing to be built up whilst the devil was trying to tear him down in that moment. So every test from God has temptation associated with it. And every temptation has a moment of testing associated with it as well. And that's what we find in this story of God testing Abraham. And we see in verse 1, it says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Abraham was open to God's call. He was open to what God was asking him to do, because he knew that God was with him always from that chapter before. And we don't know quite how Abraham reacts in himself. We don't know, it doesn't describe in the passage the inner pain he felt, although I'm sure it did. It doesn't describe the wrestling that he went through, although I'm sure he did. But in the beginning of verse 3 of chapter 22, we see that he obeys because early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He also took his two servants with him and everything for the fire and the altar. And that's not one of my slides. Everything for the sacrifice, including Isaac, but not a offering that was normal in those times. Even though Abraham obeys, I'm sure it was a real challenge for him. And I don't know if any of you have ever felt the call of God that has challenged you. God asking you to give something up or take something up, something that really cost. Something like Jonah, where God asked him to go and speak to the worst sort of people, those that were considered the biggest enemy of Israel at that time in Nineveh. Or maybe God's asking you, like Jesus did to the rich young ruler, to give up everything and follow him. Or maybe God is asking you something absurd, like Peter, when the Spirit said to him, take and eat from the unclean food. Maybe God is saying, live here, befriend these people, give this much to your church, raise children in this way, reject this from culture, to do this for a job, share the gospel with those people. God is asking us to do things all of the time. Abraham was somebody who was open to God's voice. He was open to what God was calling him to do. And he knew that God had called him to a new land and that he'd got that new place to live, and it was good. And he knew that God kept his promises because God had promised him a son, and he had a son. But that was still a challenge and a dreadful choice for Abraham to make. But he obeyed and he was open to God. So when we have those choices, those moments to choose to sacrifice for God, we can remember who God is. So Abraham had a dreadful choice, but he also took a daring risk. And faith always involves risk. It always involves an element of unknown. Now, all of us take risks throughout our lives. Some we do just because of the experience we have in our lives. I guess that to a certain extent there is a risk in sitting in one of these chairs, because at some point one of these chairs will fail if they're left long enough. But we know from experience that actually that's reality, that is not going to happen, but there is an element of risk. I guess the classic example is always a risk when you're going to cross the road. You don't quite know what the other motorists are going to do. And then some people are always willing to take risks a little bit further. People who do daring things like rock climbing or surfing or sailing or something else that's a little bit more extreme. And the British Mountaineering Council talks of climbing and mountaineering like this. It says, the BMC recognizes that climbing and mountaineering are activities with a danger of personal injury or death. Participants in these activities should be aware and accept these risks and be responsible for their own actions. We are all willing to take risks, and we all do things to mitigate risks. And faith involves that risk in stepping out into the unknown. And we're going to watch another quite famous clip of Indiana Jones taking a risk.
Impossible. Nobody can jump this.
Indy, you must hurry! Come quickly!
It's a leap of faith. must believe.
A spoiler alert, Indiana Jones wins. But just like people that are willing to step out and take risks, and Indiana Jones stepped out and took a risk there, a step of faith, Abraham also takes that step of faith. Now, Abraham was a comfortable person. He was well off in those days. Wealth was measured by livestock, and he had a good amount of livestock. He had a good home, he had a family, and he knew God's blessing. But still, he was willing to step out in faith. So even though he was comfortable, he was willing to be stretched by God. And I don't know if anybody has ever seen the diagram that's going to come up on the screen, but it's called comfort zone. So in the middle, we're in our safe space. We're comfortable, we're at ease, we're relaxed. And then outside of our comfort zone is our stretch zone or learning zone. When we step into that, we're stepping into the unknown, and we're to some extent, and we're stepping into an experience that, although stretches us, we're going to learn from and develop from and grow. Past that is our panic zone, where if we go straight from our comfort zone into that, with an area of things where we're just going to freak out and it's going to do us more harm than good. And actually what we need to do is, when we step out of our comfort zone into our stretch zone, we learn something and we go back into our comfort zone. And then when we go back into our stretch zone and learning, it's a little bit more familiar. And the more we do that, the more our comfort zone grows, to the extent that what was once our panic zone can become our stretch zone. So the more we do it, the more we step out in faith, the more we learn of God's goodness, of God's provision, of that he is always with us, as Abraham did. And we can see that even though there is a certain amount of unknown, Abraham is willing to step out into his stretch zone. In chapter 22, verse 5, it says, he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back." Abraham, in that moment, trusted God, that even though he had asked this outrageous thing of Abraham, this awful thing, Abraham knew who God was and knew that he would bring his son back. We read in Hebrews 11 that Abraham thought Isaac would be resurrected and come back that way, but he knew that God was with him and that God would provide. And we see that he himself states in verse 8 that God would provide. You see, Abraham was being stretched, but that stretch was becoming his comfort zone. And that verse is expanded to say that God himself would provide a lamb. Because as we know, this section of scripture, you may have heard before, is an echo of God the Father and God the Son, and the Son being the willing sacrifice. In this story, Isaac is not a young boy. He is probably a teenager or a young man, and could have easily overpowered or at least struggled away from an aging Abraham. And this story is a wonderful picture of a loving father who is committed. And it's a wonderful picture of a humble son who is willing to do what the father asks of him. And there's a picture in this of Isaac carrying the wood against Jesus carrying the cross. And that sacrifice that he made, the ultimate sacrifice that he made, the ultimate risk that he took for us. And you see, we are in positions of comfort often in this country. We might not feel like it because bills are a bit higher, but with a global perspective, we are relatively comfortable. And actually, our society says that we should go to a good school so we can get a good job, so we can get a good house, so that we can raise children, so that they can then go to a good school and get a good job and get a good house, so that they can raise. And we're encouraged into that perpetual cycle. And I'm not saying there's anything bad with that. It's good to send our kids to a good school so they can get a good education. And it's good to provide for our families and our children. But our highest priority shouldn't be that our comfort. It should be God. It's comfort that stops the rich young ruler from giving up all his possessions for Jesus. It's comfort that stops Jonah going to Nineveh the first time and going the opposite direction. It's comfort that is stopping our culture in general being very risk averse from being willing to step out. And you see, it is comfort that limits risk. I wonder, where is our comfort hindering our faith? Where is comfort hindering us even being open and willing to take the risks that Abraham took? Because when we take that step of faith, we can remember who God is. So Abraham had a dreadful choice. He had a choice to make. He took a daring risk, but it all led to a deepening experience. John Mark Comer says that faith equals a confidence in reality. Faith isn't just a religious thing. Faith is a human thing. And faith is something, as we've shown a little already, is something that we grow into. We are formed and we gain more and more faith as we go on. And God highlights this in the passage. And verse 11 and 12 is not a deja vu of the earlier passage, but is God reminding and God giving Abraham perspective. In verse 11, he calls Abraham again just when he's about to plunge the knife into Isaac. And Abraham is still open to God and he still says, "Here I am." And again, in verse 12, God reminds him that Isaac is his son, his only son. The story comes full circle, and God says that test is Abraham has passed. And they look over and they see a ram in a thicket, and they sacrifice that and worship God with the lamb. And Abraham goes on to describe that place that they were in as God will provide. So he started this whole section knowing that God is with him always. And he ended up with an even deeper experience of God, knowing that God would provide even in the harshest of conditions. When we step out in faith, we are exercising our spiritual muscles, so to speak. And in that, we find that God provides for us. In exercising our spiritual muscles, we find deeper relationship with God. We know more of the character of God. Something that I have always tried to step into is sharing words and pictures that I believe God has for me to share with other people. And there are moments when it has gone really well and I feel like I'm so close to God. There are other moments, I have to confess, where I share things and it falls flat and it's nobody it thinks it's for them and you just look a bit silly. I remember I was at a youth festival and praying for one of my youth group at the time. and had this picture for them and shared it with them. And they went away and didn't really say anything of it and kind of like seemed nonplussed by the experience. A few weeks later, though, I got a card that says, "What you shared with me was just what I needed in that moment. It's helped reinvigorate my faith in God." And even though, for me, I had to exercise that spiritual muscle, I had to step out and risk looking a bit stupid, but was able to help bless this young person. There was another time at a youth event here in Wickham, and I felt that there was somebody there who had a bad wrist. And I got up and shared, I think there's somebody here whose left wrist is hurting, and nothing. Just everybody looking at me completely blankly. A bit like this. But everybody looking at me blankly. So we moved on. I felt really silly and almost wished I hadn't done it. But then after the meeting, this young person came up to me and said, "That's me. It's been hurting in my left wrist when I've been typing." And then I was able to get a few others, and we were able to pray for God to heal her wrist. There's also time when I felt like I had a word for somebody on a Skype call for a mentoring group for Christian leaders, and shared it, and there was absolutely nothing. And actually at that point, I'd stepped out and it wasn't a word for anybody, it's just me thinking of something. But if we don't step out, if we don't exercise those spiritual muscles, then we don't see the goodness of God at work. And there might be times when it's not quite right and we look a bit silly, but actually those times of seeing God at work are so much better than any moment of perceived failure. So what happens when God asks us to sacrifice all? And this can be a really hard topic to talk about, because for some of you it's felt like a massive sacrifice to come here this morning. And your life feels like there's no space to sacrifice anything because we're so busy. And there was a verse this morning when we were praying, we were reminded of Jesus saying, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." And actually, when God tests us, when God is there looking to build us up, to form us, to know him better, it might be hard in that moment, but it's to lift us up. He wants to carry us as well. He wants to bring us into that deeper relationship of knowing that his burden is ultimately light. So I wonder, is God calling you to join one of our new missional communities? Is he asking you to start a missional community in a busy life? If there's something you're really passionate about, a group of people you want to reach that God is provoking you with? Is God calling you to help a smaller church in some way? Is God asking you to support a marginalized group or even an undesirable group? Refugees, drug addicts, sex workers, homeless people. Has God been provoking you for mission overseas? Is God provoking you in your finances to sacrifice more, or even start sacrificing something? Is God asking you to sacrifice in giving something up, giving up social media, alcohol, certain TV shows, addictive habits? Is God calling you to serve in a specific area of church? God is calling us to sacrifice for him. And we can know, like Abraham, that he is the everlasting God who provides for us. So as we go out of here, I want to encourage you to think about two things. One is a spirit level, and one is a compass. A spirit level helps us find a parallel or perpendicular based on our foundation. And we need to set our spiritual level. We need to seek Jesus first. We need to seek his kingdom first. We need to remember who he is and get to know him better, because he is our level in an uneven world. And then we need to set our spiritual compass, find our direction of travel from that foundation. When you use a map and a compass, you take a bearing and you find your direction and you step out. And it is a step of faith, because even if you have a map and it's quite detailed, you're not quite sure how long ago that map was made. You don't know if the stream on the map has become a river, and you don't know if the path that is marked there has now been taken back over by nature. So we need to follow God's direction and know that Jesus promises to be with us always. As I finish, I want to share a story that of our lives. Hannah and I, we've been married 12 years, and I can remember that. But in the last 12 years, we lived in 5 different locations, and we've lived in 7 different homes. We've moved around quite a lot. And there have been times when we felt that God is calling us to somewhere new, and it has been times when it has been really, really difficult to move, because we have made good friends and there is family close to us. For instance, our last 2 moves, we moved from Winchester to Bristol. And if you've ever been to Winchester, it's lovely. It's really, really nice and a really, really comfortable place to live in. And it's got really beautiful scenery around it. And we had amazing friends, some of whom are still really great friends. And we moved to Bristol, and although that was a really nice city as well, we didn't know anybody there. We moved there because we felt God was calling us to move there because of a job, because of our situation. It was the right time to move. And actually within that, we saw God's blessing, and we saw our children grow and flourish, and we made new friends there. And Bristol is I would say, in my experience, is an even nicer place it turned out to live, and it's got more that's going on. It's got even better countryside around it. But then we felt we thought actually we are called to Bristol long term. It turns out we just like northwest Bristol where we live. And God was calling us to move to High Wycombe. And for us, that was an even harder move, because I'd been to High Wycombe once, and I don't think Hannah had ever been here before when we decided this was the right place to come to. And we definitely didn't know anybody, and it was a little bit further away from our family and definitely further away from friends. But actually what we've seen is the provision of God in it, and I would say in many ways we've made even deeper relationships here than we have in Bristol. And we have come to an amazing church that has supported us and nurtured us and helped us grow. And as I look back, I can see that those moments of stepping out in faith, those moments of risk, those moments of exercising spiritual muscle, we've seen God at work and God look after our family. So we can step out in faith knowing that God has got it. We can risk knowing that he wants the best for us. And we can allow and seek deeper relationship knowing that he will provide. And through it all, we can remember who God is. Would you please stand?